Hello and welcome to this 2024 Candidates Chess Tournament game review. And if you didn't know, we have a new 17-year-old World Championship or World Chess Championship challenger, Gukesh, only 17. So he won the Candidates Tournament, and I have the game for you here from the final round where he needed to draw to stay in the lead in case any of the other players won. But there were three players behind him by half a point. So Gukesh went into the final 14th round with a half a point lead. And Caruana, Nepomniachtchi, and Nakamura were the three players that were half a point behind. Now, Gukesh had to play Nakamura, so he needed a draw here, or a win. And on the other side, with Caruana and Nepomniachtchi playing, if they won and Gukesh had a draw, then there'd be a playoff. But Caruana and Nepomniachtchi had a 109 move draw, which I won't show here or the video will be even longer. But let's take a look at this game here. So Nakamura had the white pieces. And if he wanted to go to the World Chess Championship, he needed a win here. A draw just wouldn't do it. So he had the white pieces. So that helps. But he played at 98.1% accuracy with three great moves, and that didn't do it because his opponent played at 98.3% accuracy. It looks like 2 inaccuracies by Nakamura and 3 by his opponent. But look at this game graph here. The game is pretty much even the whole way through. Black even had a slight edge early in the game, and then it's just even all the way to the end. So crazy stuff. Let's take a look at this. Before we do, what did the computer say here? The game ended evenly, but white had some nice moves in there. And then this says that game was pretty competitive. Black played better than white in the opening. It was an incredible middle game by both players, and both players had incredible precision in the end game. Nakamura playing at 2900 rating level in that game, and 2950 by his opponent. So in the opening, 96.6 versus 97.1, and then in the middle game, 97.4 versus 97.7. And then 99.2 in the end game, but his opponent had 99.2 as well. So great job by both players. So with the analysis on, let's take a look and see what happened here. Nakamura begins with d4. So you would think if he wanted to try and go for a win, maybe he would play e4 to make things a little more aggressive. But d4 is played, d5, and c4, the Queen's Gambit, which, if you haven't seen that show, The Queen's Gambit on Netflix, I believe, check it out. It's a pretty good show. So now we have the Queen's Gambit accepted by Gukesh. So Gukesh captures the pawn. Knight to f3 is played, ignoring this pawn. You could capture immediately or take the pawn back immediately with queen to a4 check and then move over and grab the pawn. But instead, Nakamura develops pieces, as does his opponent here. So now with e3, the bishop is threatening to capture this pawn, but e6 is played, ignoring that. So the pawn is captured, and now the material is even once again. And then we have bishop to e7, knight to c3. So both sides developing their pieces. Nakamura now has to decide what to do about this attack on his D pawn by the C pawn here. So that's ignored, and A3 is played in inaccuracy, which the computer prefers just castling here. And now we have another inaccuracy by Gukesh, who castles, but now the computer said it would have been better to play A6, which might look something like this. A6, castling, and now an attack on the bishop here. So if the bishop retreats here, now the computer says A2 would be a better retreat. Then you have capture in the center, queen captures, queen trade. So this is a possibility of how the game could have played out. But back to the game. After A3, the inaccuracy is played. Now we have castling, another inaccuracy, and instead of that A6 move. And the game continues with castling by white, and then finally the A6 move is played, threatening this forward momentum of the pawns and chasing the bishop away. So that is ignored with queen to E2, although the computer would rather white capture this C pawn, because otherwise he could be left with an isolated pawn possible here. So B5, retreat, and capture of the pawn. So now the knight could have captured, but then maybe there's a possibility of that knight being chased away by E5 in the future. And so Nakamura goes into an isolated queen pawn game here, where it does give you a half open E file and the open C file for your rooks to use, but the more pieces are traded off, the harder it'll be to defend this isolated pawn in the endgame. So the game continues with B4, attacking the knight and the pawn here. Computer prefers a capture of this pawn, but that's ignored, and the knight instead retreats, or, well, I shouldn't say retreat, moves forward, attacking this knight here. So capture of the pawns, we have an exchange, and bishop to B7, lining up on the knights and the king side here. So Gukesh, would like to just trade off as much material as he can, and Nakamura is trying to avoid that and get something going here. So computer would rather he jump forward, but then the bishop could possibly just capture and trade off more material. So this gives Gukesh a chance to jump forward, blockading the isolated pawn with a knight, which is usually best because the knight can jump over the isolated pawn. So he's blocking the pawn from moving, but he's also attacking all these squares around that pawn. Okay. Here we can take a look, if I go back a little bit, what would have happened if that knight did jump forward. So if the knight, instead of retreating, if it jumped forward up here to C5, so attacking the bishop, well, then you could have just had an exchange, and the pawn moves further up the board, but pieces have been exchanged off, and then this knight attacks, and the bishop would defend. And what do they recommend next? Queen to E7. Maybe the pawn is harder to defend out here. All right. Well, back to the game. Knight retreats back, and then we have Gukesh's knight jumping forward on this outpost and blockading the isolated pawn. So bishop to D2 is played, just getting this bishop off the back rank. But the computer prefers giving up the bishop pair and taking this knight. So instead we have exchange of knights, and slowly white is being left with less pieces here, and you try to avoid that in the isolated queen pawn situations. But now we have knight to d7 just developing, and the bishop. So this bishop repositions. It's kind of blocked by this set of pawns here. So it moves back, and now it's aiming at this open diagonal up towards the king side. So now the rook moves to the open file. The bishop retreats back, also aiming up towards the king side. And the knight jumps over here to defend the king side, and also to be able to jump to d5 possibly and blockade the isolated pawn. So the game continues with bishop to d3, which the computer says is best. Now we have a bishop queen battery aimed at this pawn on a6 and only one defender. So instead of trying to defend that, Gukesh trades off more material, taking the knight, giving up his bishop pair, and now we have the queen grabbing the isolated pawn in the center. And here, white is not able to pick off this a6 pawn, of course, or this will be picked off, his bishop on d2. So, what does he do here? Brings his rook over to line up on the queen. And then the queen slides over to put pressure on this pawn. Although the bishop can't capture this at the moment, because then that bishop would just be pinned by the rook to the queen. And the queen is helping defend this pawn over on a6, which the bishop was targeting. So the queen jumps up here, adding more pressure to this a6 pawn. And what does Gukesh do here? Well, he ignores that pawn and lines up on the king here. So next we have, instead of capturing that pawn and going pawn hunting, Nakamura defends this f-pawn to prevent any attacks on this f-pawn, maybe with the knight jumping forward and the queen lining up on this. The computer actually prefers h3, which would keep the knight out of the white's king side over here. So the pawn moves forward here, where it's a little more defended, and the light squared bishop is not attacking it, but now the dark squared bishop is attacking. So the game continues with queen to b5 here. Asking Gukesh, do you want to trade off queens? Well, that seems to be fine for Gukesh, who is going for the draw. But it looks like even better would have been queen to f4. So we could take a quick look at that. Instead of trading off queens, queen to f4 would put more pressure on this f-pawn. G3 could be played to attack the queen, and then the queen centralizes, threatening a possible capture of this pawn, then taking the queen. Well, I take that back. That wouldn't work, because if the bishop captured and then a capture here, the bishop would be able to recapture. So let's see. Well, we could take a quick look at that. Does that actually give you a piece here? So let's say rook at A to B1. Okay, so they're already... Looks like this would be the recommendation here. And then capturing here would not work. So, okay, let's get on with the rest of this before I drag the video out too long. So, back to what happened in the game. The queens are traded. So we'll go back a little bit here. We have a queen trade. Bishop ends up here on b5, which will allow this pawn to push forward. So we have a defense of this pawn that was under attack by the bishop on e1. So the rooks are fighting for control of the c-file here. And now the knight jumps into this nice outpost in the center of the board. And at the moment, black is ahead by 1 pawn. So Nakamura centralizes, or brings his king towards the center, I should say. And now we have rooks just lining up on each other. So what will happen next? Well, the pawn finally pushes forward, keeping the space even on the queen side, and here the bishop can defend this pawn. Although the computer prefers a retreating bishop move instead. Okay, so Gukesh moves his king closer towards the center, and then the game continues with g3, keeping the knight out of black's, or excuse me, white's position over here on the king side. So the king moves up to the center. Both kings are moving, trying to get up here towards the action in the endgame. The pawns start pushing forward, and a rook is centralized, threatening to double rooks on the c-file. Black captures, which is best, and recaptured by the bishop. And now we have the knight jumping forward here. And what are the possible threats? Well, the knight, is closer to white's side of the board, but we also have the open file for the rook now. So what will happen next? Rook to b1. White, wanting to try and get a win, is avoiding the trade of these rooks. And bishop to c5. So now the rook lines up on this unprotected bishop. The knight drops back here. And what is the best move? The computer says bishop to a6 is best here. Just moving forward, attacking the knight and the bishop at the same time. What was played? Bishop to c3, which prevents this knight from creating any surprises, I should say, by jumping forward with a check. Now, what would happen if we had this bishop to a6? Well, I may have gotten that wrong. I said bishop to b5, but the computer actually mentioned bishop to a6. So what happens if you do that? Well, then you have this knight to d4 move, which would give an edge to black, and it would give you time to move the bishop out of the way. All right, so what about, well, let me look at that. Excuse me. If you played this move, knight to d4 is what we were looking at with check. Okay, now, instead of that bishop to b5 move, what if you took a pawn? Oh, the same thing. The knight checks, king has to move, so you can't take this pawn on e6 and then have a discovered attack on the bishop, because the knight will just capture, or sorry, check, then capture and defend the bishop. All right, so it just shows you how there's many hidden tactics that these grandmasters just see all these tactics, and they know what to play into and what not most of the time. I mean, even they fall to some crazy tactics. So next we have knight to c6. Bishops lining up here. This bishop is keeping the knight back, and then the pawns start pushing. So an attack on the undefended knight. This bishop moves back, attacking the rook, or sorry, moves forward, attacking the rook. So now Looks like rook to c2 is best. All right. Rook to c2 is played. And now knight to d4 check. So forking these two pieces, and the bishop just knocks that knight out. But Gukesh has managed to get rid of Hikaru's bishop pair here. And as more pieces are exchanged, it's harder to go for the win. So the game continues with a check, and Nakamura is able to pick off a pawn. So now the material is even again. So we continue with bishop to b4, just moving up here, defending the pawn, and kind of seeing what Nakamura will do next. Now we have the bishop retreat blocking. Oh, and this bishop also threatened to allow the rook to check down here and maybe cause some problems. So Gukesh plays e5, which the computer says is an inaccuracy, that it would have been better instead to play bishop up to f8 and try and trap this rook in, or at least minimize the available moves of that rook. The game might have continued with b5 here, then bishop to g7 blocking in the rook, and the rook could still move forward, and then I don't know, maybe e4 check. And from here, if the king tried to go after the rook, well, the bishop could swing up here and protect and check the king away. So in the game, we had e5 instead, the inaccuracy, but the game continues here, and according to the computer, it's dead even. So pawns push, we have a trade of pawns, and now black has this isolated, isolated but passed pawn. And so the bishop is under attack, moves up here and defends the pawn. And now we have this bishop dropping back, also to restrict the movement of this rook here. But the pawns are pushed forward, and Nakamura obtains a passed h-pawn here. So now we have the rook moving over here, kind of getting away from the king, where it could drop down here, maybe start checking the king and harassing white's king. And rook to h5 is played, which prevents black's king from kind of being able to come down here and help escort this pawn forward. It just cuts him off. So the game continues with king moving up here to get in front of this passed pawn so that it can't reach the promotion square. And now we have bishop up to d7, just allowing white to capture this pawn here. So in response, black attacks the bishop. And now what does Nakamura do? He retreats his bishop back. And now this bishop retreats. So interesting play here. Now the rook repositions, and then we have a capture of this passed pawn. But this pawn is captured. And so now they both have an isolated pawn. White's is way over here on the queen side, far away from the king. So it looks pretty dangerous, whereas white is guarding this passed pawn in the center. So the king moves up, rook drops all the way back to give room for this pawn to start marching forward, and bishop here to g5, where there's a threat of a possible check, and this might help the pawn push forward. The game continues with bishop to h5, although the computer prefers immediately pushing that pawn. So now check, king moves, and the rook gets behind the passed pawn, which is very important anytime there's a passed pawn, and you can get either your rook behind your own passed pawn, or if it's your opponent's, try to get behind that passed pawn and keep an eye on it so it's harder to promote it. All right, the pawn starts moving, and now we have a series of checks against the white king. And they continue, and finally the king moves back here to stay in front of black's passed pawn. So now the rook moves up, eyeing the pawn and the bishop, and the king moves forward here, which the computer says is a great move. Now we have the bishop moving away and attacking the pawn at the same time. So what do you do here? The pawn is pushed, ignoring the attack on the bishop. So capture. And what other options were there instead of letting that bishop be captured? So instead of pushing the pawn, was there another possibility which involved protecting this bishop? Well, if you move the bishop, then it looks like you would just be able to pick off the passed pawn here. So Nakamura had to make a choice. If he saves his bishop, then the bishop and rook could just capture this pawn. So instead, we have the pawn moving forward. The bishop is just sacrificed, and the pawn marches up the board. And now behind the passed pawn once again, but there's a check allowing the passed pawn to move forward. So the king has to get out of check, but now the pawn is promoted to a queen. The rook has to sacrifice itself to get rid of that queen. Capture, and now the pawn pushes forward. Although the computer actually wanted the bishop to retreat back. But the game, according to the computer, is dead even now. The king is cut off, but what can you do? The king will just move all around, and the bishop and pawn can just stay there. And if the king moves too far away, or the rook, the pawn could try and move forward and promote. So capture, capture, and the game ended in a draw at 71 moves. So congratulations to Gukesh with a great draw against the difficult player Nakamura, who is rated, I believe, number 3 in the world right now. So outstanding job by Gukesh, who is the 17-year-old World Chess Championship challenger. So we can look forward to seeing him play at the end of the year. And we'll have to watch many more exciting tournament games from this young rising star. All right. Well, please like and support the channel if you haven't already. Feel free to leave comments, concerns, suggestions, or any requests for stuff you would like to see in the future. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.